To introduce Dr. Iris Mauss, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology at UC Berkeley, where she runs the Emotion and Emotion Regulation Lab. And her work and her team really use a variety of daily diaries, laboratory experiments, behavioral assessments, and also measures of physiological responses that I know we're all in this space very excited about to link emotion and emotion regulatory processes to health. And she's received numerous prestigious awards for her research, including a distinguished scientific award for early career contributions to social psychology from APA, as well as the Carol and Ed Diener Award in personality psychology from SPSP. And of course, I have to mention that she's not only an excellent researcher, but also such a strong teacher and graduate mentor, earning awards from both UC Berkeley and from Stanford for her teaching and mentoring. So we're so excited to have Dr. Mauss here today. And thank you to everyone who's here in person and on Zoom for joining for this Aging Metabolism and Emotion Center seminar. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Iris Mauss.
Hi, everybody. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you so much, Eric, for shepherding me on a little adventure. And yeah, I love being here. First time in the new building. Yeah, sorry again, I was late. And so today I will share some new research on approaches to happiness and links with psychological health. But before I get started, I wanted to announce, especially to those here in person, that we're going to have a meeting of the Bay Area Affective Science Society. Probably you've heard about it, but just putting in a reminder, especially for postdocs and students, to submit abstracts and posters by the end of this upcoming weekend. And also just come if you don't feel like presenting. We're going to have talks by Jeannie Tsai, Paul Hastings, Wendy Mendez, Brian Knudsen, and Bob Levinson. And this is for the meeting on June 10th at UC Davis. And in the link, you can also just sign up for emails so that you're always in the loop to stay connected to the Bay Area Affective Science community. So usually I would talk about emotions and their crucial role in well-being, health, and resilience. And we, of course, know quite a bit about the role of emotions in those things, in large part because of all the amazing research that goes on in this group here. But today, as I noted, I want to sort of shake it up a little bit and presenting some newer in prep work that we're all thinking about. So emotions, of course, have a really important role. In that everybody has emotions. And one might even say that we're always in some emotional state or other. And we know quite a bit about emotions and their role in health. What we know a little bit less about, but what's also really important is how people think about their own emotions and how they react to their own emotions. And I would say that that's maybe as important, maybe even more important than these initial emotional responses. And in that everybody has sort of strong intuitions about their own emotions. Here's one example of one such intuition. B.F. Skinner said, "We all know that emotions are useless and bad for our peace of mind and blood pressure." So that's a really negative thought about emotions. Here's another example, also really strong, by David Hume. "Reason is and ought to be the servant of passion." And what these examples illustrate is that people have strong intuitions about what their emotions are, how they should react to them, and also people vary quite widely. And so what I want to think about is what people think about and how they react to their emotions and what role those reactions play in well-being, health, and resilience. Building on others' research on related phenomena. And one emotional state that I think arguably people have especially elaborate and strong intuitions about is happiness. People have many and strong thoughts about happiness. I don't have to look really far and wide to find examples and illustrations for this. This is just like a really brief, you can come up with this kind of an array of books in like 10 minutes. This is just a tiny sample, right? And you see sort of titles like The How of Happiness, Positivity, 14,000 Things to Be Happy About, and Happy Damn It, and so forth. So happiness is really strongly represented in our culture and in people's minds, not just psychologists and philosophers. Here's a more scientific illustration of the idea that people around the world highly value happiness. This is a study by Ed Diener showing a few of the countries he surveyed on having people rate how important happiness is to them. And you can see that across all these countries, people are basically stuck kind of at the ceiling of this 1 to 7 point scale. And this kind of a value of happiness is really straightforward and makes a lot of sense, right? We know, including from alumni of this lab group here, that valuing happiness leads people to pursue happiness. And the more people pursue happiness, the more happy they are. And there's research in support of this idea. So that all is really straightforward, makes a lot of sense. But of course, we can't just have anything be really straightforward and simple. As psychologists, we tend to complicate things. So with Brett Ford, what we argued is that maybe it's not always quite so simple and straightforward. And in particular, we thought that happiness might be a peculiar emotional state. The more we value happiness, the more highly we expect to be happy. We could say the higher standards we set for our happiness. And in general, that's quite all right. But there's something peculiar in that when we fall short of those standards, we might be disappointed. We might feel discontent because we're not reaching our goals. And those very emotions are inconsistent with the very thing that we're striving toward. So there might be a self-defeating element to valuing happiness. And in turn, these moments of disappointment might add up to lead to decreased happiness over time. And in a few initial studies, we basically just try to look at whether simply people who value happiness, whether they are more happy. And we did this by developing a scale that measured individual differences in value and happiness, with items like feeling happy is extremely important to me. We asked people about those values as well as recent life stress, because we felt that there might be a moderating effect of extent to which happiness was within reach, if you will, in people's lives. This graph here shows results for what we call hedonic balance, trait positive over trait negative affect. And you're gonna see results broken down by life stress. So on the right are people with high life stress, on the left, low levels of life stress. And as you see, people who recently had a lot of stress in their lives, no matter how strongly they valued happiness, have really low levels of trait hedonic balance. That makes sense. But now people with low life stress, these are the people where we thought might activate that standard and the feeling of disappointment because their lives have been going really well. And here, indeed, we see that we're finding the exact opposite of the straightforward model's expectations. So people who value happiness more have lower levels of hedonic balance compared to those who value happiness less. And we're replicating the exact same pattern with depression symptoms. So low life stress, we're finding that difference between valuing happiness less versus more with those who actually don't value happiness as much, showing lower levels of depression symptoms. So there were other studies replicating this finding, leading to kind of two seemingly contradictory bodies of research. On the one hand, valuing happiness leads to increased happiness. On the other hand, we're finding indication that valuing happiness leads to decreased happiness, leading us and others to ask, how can we reconcile this really vexing contradiction in the research? And we approached this based on a model that was developed by Felicia Zerwis and Brett Ford, and in collaboration with Oliver John. Basically asking, when and why is valuing happiness self-defeating? Because we don't think anymore that it's always and necessarily a bad thing. We built on a model by Brett and Felicia, where basically they conceptualize valuing happiness as emotional goal pursuit, specifically pursuing happiness as a goal. And we're thinking that there's sort of this model points to two entrance points in the process where individual differences can enter that will help us explain when and why valuing happiness might be self-defeating. The first one is at the very beginning of the process, where we're thinking that people can vary with regard to simply how strongly they endorse this value. And we're calling this aspiring to happiness. It's basically the simple value of happiness with no further elaboration. Feeling happy is extremely important to me. The more you aspire to happiness in this way, the more you're gonna have happiness as a goal, perhaps more often, perhaps more intensely. We can maybe talk about that later, the sort of like difference of frequency and intensity. And as you sort of go through your life, it's gonna set you up to make those comparisons between your goal and where you are currently. There might be times when there's gaps between those two, and those gaps, everything else being equal, will lead you to prioritize and more vigorously pursue happiness to close that gap, right? Like in a cybernetic model. And depending on your ability to do so, this might then be either innocuous or it might increase your happiness levels. But as I go through this model, you might kind of think about that comparison point. And to our minds, that's sort of like a really crucial moment in the process, because here people come up against a gap between how they're currently feeling and how they want to feel. And we're thinking that that gap might mean very different things to different people, where from mindfulness and acceptance research, we know that people have a tendency to imbue gaps like that with really negative meanings. It's sort of almost like a moralized understanding of our emotions. And one particularly salient reaction might be a concern along the lines of, if I don't feel happy, maybe there's something wrong with me. I worry about my levels of happiness. And so that's the second point in the model where individual differences might play a really important role in shaping the outcomes of valuing happiness. Because the moment I'm concerned, the moment I elaborate negatively on my levels of happiness, no matter where I am, I'm going to imbue positive experiences, and maybe especially positive experiences with negativity, right? Because I'm setting myself up to worry and to be disappointed and discontented. And over time, those experiences then rob us of the ability to have positive emotions in our lives, leading to decreased happiness over time. So that's our model, and it leads to 3 pretty straightforward predictions. First, we're predicting that there should be 2 distinct facets of valuing happiness. One sort of just aspiring, go for it, happiness value, and one that's more concerned about happiness no matter where I currently am. And they should have distinct associations with well-being. Aspiring should be innocuous or positive. Concern should be self-defeating. And it should be self-defeating because it injects negativity in happy events that sort of activate the value and negative meta-emotion. All right, so how did we go about testing this? The room is an interesting layout. I feel like I'm at a tennis match.
I know, and you got people right there.
It's a really beautiful room. So also, I should say I don't have an agenda to like go through all my slides. So ask questions, happy to have discussion as we go. I really don't need to get through all my slides, but also I know we're gonna have discussion afterwards. So we developed a scale to measure those 2 distinct facets of happiness. 4 items each. And just to illustrate, the aspiring items were feeling happy is extremely important to me, but they're also pretty extreme, as you notice. So we're not kind of like messing around. There's items like I value things in life only to the extent that they influence my personal happiness. One item was about like my life is only worthwhile to the extent that I'm happy at any given moment. So they're pretty extreme. And here are the concern items. They're items like if I don't feel happy, maybe there's something wrong with me, or I'm concerned about my happiness even when I feel happy. And that's important. We're not looking for people who are unhappy and worried about that. It's like regardless of your level of happiness. We tested these 2 facets in interkers, undergrads, and community samples. And across the samples, we're finding evidence of 2 reliable scales that are distinct, but also correlated with one another, as you might expect from those items. So they're related but distinct facets in support of the basic model of approaches to happiness. This graph here simply shows 2 things. One is that people have about normal distributions, a little bit skewed for the concern subscale, and they really fall across the whole range of the scale from 1 all the way to 7. And on average, about at the midpoint. So we have really nice individual variation on both of those facets that will now allow us to test the question of how they're linked with happiness. So in other words, is concern, but not aspiring, self-defeating when people pursue happiness. And we examined that question in 2 exploratory and 1 pre-registered sample of the 5 samples I showed you. And we're gonna be looking at a comprehensive well-being composite made up of satisfaction with life, psychological well-being, as sort of like positive elements, and then depression symptoms as a negative element. And here you're seeing that aspiring to happiness is overall not reliably and on average not linked with well-being. So it seems to be innocuous. But now here are the people who are more, or here are links with concern about happiness. And what you're seeing is that across the various samples, people who are more concerned about happiness are less happy. So it seems to have a self-defeating element. Now, the last question we wanted to ask is, does this concern have these negative associations because it sort of spoils positive events of the day? And we addressed this in a community sample. This was only women. They filled out surveys. They then completed 8 days of daily diaries, where they reported what was the most positive thing that happened to you today, as well as their negative meta emotions. How did they feel about their feelings? Items like, I should have enjoyed the event more. And then 6 months later, we assessed well-being. And so what we're finding is that once again, concern about happiness predicted well-being 6 months later. It also predicted negative meta emotions during the day's most positive events. And in turn, those there was a significant indirect effect. So those negative meta emotions explained the link between concern and well-being. And so you might sort of wonder whether that could just be explained by things like general worry, right? As you might expect, I'm somebody who worries about my happiness. I also generally worry. But while that is true, these links hold when I control for general worry. So there seems to be something specific about worrying about my concern about my happiness. Also, you might think that, well, maybe people who are concerned about their happiness have sort of, and who have negative meta emotions, have sort of less fun or less joyful, objectively positive events happening to them, right? And that's why they're concerned, and that's why they are disappointed. And so we also controlled for intensity of positive events, and the link once again holds. So there seems to be something specific about the way in which people who are concerned approach positive events. And then aspiring, in contrast, did not predict well-being 6 months later, and it also didn't predict negative meta emotions. So there's something specific here.
So how does aspiring fit into prioritizing positivity, that idea? Because that does predict positive, but aspiring doesn't predict positive.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and we haven't yet worked it out with Bob Fredrickson and Lana Catalino. Because you would like, and in the model, we saw it predicting, in our theoretical model, we're thinking that sort of like just aspiring would nudge people to prioritize
So
positivity.
it's not the same construct.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly, and so I should say we haven't yet empirically looked at the link between specifically aspiring when we control for concern and its links with the prioritizing positivity scale.
Right,
So,
which is more kind of daily behavioral small actions. So it's definitely a much more direct path to positive affect, I think.
Yeah, so, but at the same, so that's the theory part. And at the same time, we were a little bit surprised that on the whole, aspiring doesn't strongly predict well-being. So there's two parts I think that we need to do. One is sort of directly look at whether aspiring links with prioritizing positivity. And based on this sort of pattern of finding, we don't think that it will do so in an uncomplicated or direct way. What we're thinking is that this aspiring piece is moderated, or the link between it and well-being outcomes is moderated by sort of ability that people have to translate their aspirations into everyday prioritizing positivity behaviors. To the extent that they do that, I think we would find a positive link.
Yeah.
But I think there's a piece in which not everybody knows how to go about pursuing their happiness goals. And so that's where the prioritizing positivity comes in.
And I mean, like with I couldn't remember the items for the tripods, but is it like I do this? Okay, so it's like it's not aspirational in the way that it's framed. It's
Yes,
like
a little more
to-
behavioral than
to
meta.
get positive, I do these things.
In very much so,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, very much so in daily life. Like I
Yeah.
structure my daily
Yeah, yeah.
life in ways that like gives me
Yeah.
positive emotions.
Yeah.
So it's slightly different in sort of in its concreteness, right? This is sort of like an aspirational goal. Whereas the prioritizing positivity is exactly like what you remember. It's sort of about like translating it into like everyday actions,
Right.
sort of like what I do in every day. The second way in which it's different is that it's much more about, I guess, happiness with a lowercase h. So it's about
Yeah.
happy emotions. We're very much so thinking that this is, and like showing that this works through emotional experiences, but the aspiration piece is more about happiness with a capital H. So I think they don't like directly map onto one another, but how they do so is a really important piece for us to think about.
Do you think that the little h's stack up to make a big H?
Yes. I think so. I used to not think that, but in the research, what we're finding again and again is when we look at sort of daily positive emotions, especially daily positive emotions, much less so daily negative emotions, they link up with overall emotional well-being and psychological health. And so I really think that sort of, I guess, Barb Fredrickson talks about it like a emotional diet, almost like these sort of emotions that people consume or experience through their days do add up to overall well-being and happiness, especially the positive emotions. And so that's what we're seeing in this model here, right? That sort of, at least when we're looking at it in this correlational way, they add up to well-being cross-sectionally and 6 months later. Yeah. What do you think?
I don't know. I don't think about this. So like, how does it affect your immune system? It's really whatever in your sleep. But otherwise, I mean, I guess I was wondering, I mean, it's interesting to think about kind of when people think about like what it means to be happy versus like intermittent moments of happiness. I guess that's what I was kind of unsure. Like people have this kind of idea of what it should be like or what it could be like, but like maybe don't always kind of notice the moments that are the thing that they're striving for. I don't know.
No, I think it's a really amazing and lovely question, because I think that's exactly at the core of what might be harmful about this concern element. And that's, I think that people maybe have the idea that happiness means to have positive experiences. And if those positive experiences don't match up with where I want to be, I have that gap, right, that I talked about. And that gap in itself is not a bad thing. I think it's what that gap means to people is exactly the problem. And that, I think, is where the concern piece comes in, because it amplifies that gap rather than, so the aspiring people, I think, they simply go about, there's a faster way to do that, but I'm not gonna do it there. So the aspiring, so you have that comparison, right? And the aspiring people, they have the same gap, right? Because they have really high standards for their happiness. I showed you the items, right? It's extremely important for them to be happy. So they must have the gap. But I think they sort of just move along. They're like, I'm not quite there. It's okay. I'm moving on with my life. It's the concerned people who stumble over that gap and elaborate it on it in negative ways and say, this means that there's something wrong with my life. There's something wrong with me. And that sort of injects the negativity exactly at those moments when happiness is within reach. So I don't think we're actually going to find it for negative events, because there you have sort of like an explanation for not being as happy as you ought to be. But I think we're only going to find it for those positive events. So yeah, but I think that's exactly what we're interested in, but we don't sort of like, we're trying to sort of more specifically drill down to the process of what goes on in people's minds as they're thinking about happiness, and sort of think about what happiness means to people and how that links up with how they approach it. Yeah.
How do you think about, I'm just wondering if sort of a part of a distinction between the two constructs, looking at the aspiring piece reminds me of just thinking about like enjoying the process and like getting to the point where you're building on maybe these negative experiences or challenging experiences, but at the end of the day, maybe I will feel fulfilled from that, sort of like a fulfillment through the process versus the focus on the individual moments, and is each moment like a moment of happiness almost. Between the concerned folks of this sort of, if I don't feel happy in this moment, maybe there is something wrong with me, versus, you know, this is the process of getting to where I want to be almost.
Like enjoying the path versus being stuck on evaluating each moment as an outcome or a goal stage. I'm not sure. It's really interesting question. But the reason why I'm not sort of like signing on to it is that these aspiring people, and we didn't actually necessarily think from the get-go that it would be so innocuous, but they're very goal oriented, right? And so it drives a happiness goal, I think, which is very kind of emblematic of sort of these book titles that I showed in our culture's approach to happiness, right? And so it makes a lot of sense to think, oh, you know, like this other facet, they're just people who enjoy the road, but they are still pretty goal oriented. And so I'm not sure that I would necessarily sign on to that.
I was just thinking about sort of like happiness versus meaning kind of question of like, what meaning are you getting out of the experiences? Are you like drawing on like the meaning of the experience versus the emotional response to the experience? Something along those lines. But just trying to like,
yeah, that's a really super interesting question. And so in what I was saying in response to Eric's question, I also used to think these sort of positive, I used to be a little bit down on positive emotions, to be perfectly honest, like, and I've become convinced by the data, because I used to think it is more about meaning, purpose. Wait, what is happening?
I'm just trying
Eric's waving at
I'm just
himself.
trying to see
Oh.
who was on the Zoom.
I see. Sorry. I was like, did I say something? And so for a while we thought that's the difference. Like there's these wise people who they just know that it's not about positivity. Life is about purpose and meaning. And these people know that. And that's why they're better off, rather than these sort of simpletons who just want positive experiences. Like that's, and so we dug pretty deep. This is sort of with Brett Ford and Megan Barlow, who was a postdoc, in thinking through sort of that purpose element. And so we asked people like straight up, what is happiness to you? Positive emotions versus purpose. And we've run like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 studies trying to find that people who have this more meaning, purpose understanding of happiness, the wise ones are gonna do better than the simpletons who just want hedonic experiences. We've never been able to find it. The two are actually pretty highly correlated, but even when we force them apart by making people choose, we never find that sort of this understanding of happiness as kind of simple pleasures is like such a bad thing. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that later on, but sort of
I have one question. I love this digging down. I mean, this is a fascinating discussion. Concern about happiness. So this item is just making me really wonder if there's really two paths to concern about happiness. So what you have there that you're really hinging it on is maybe there's something wrong with me. So anyone who goes to there's something wrong with me, it's going to be correlated with depression and negative affects. So like they have a strong, maybe they have a lot of self-criticism, a strong critic. And so, on the mindfulness scale, part of mindfulness is relationship to mental health is because there's a whole, subscale on self-criticism. And they frame it the reverse, which is non-judgment. So low levels of self-criticism, non-judging and not blaming. So anyway, there's a confound. I'm just wondering, is there a confound there that the attribution is it's something wrong with me? Another item, and it may act exactly the same, would be I don't feel happy because of the circumstances. And until external things, not about my actions, but until things line up, until I get that raise, until this person respects me, until this happens. So it's very much a external attribution for your lack of happiness.
But there still is something wrong, right? So that it's a beautiful question. And in part, we're thinking it's part of, that's exactly the phenomena, right? And so understanding what exactly it is, what's the nature of that judgment is the precise nature of the judgment is a really important next step. One thing I will say is that, and I think when we look at the items, right, they're not all about like there's something wrong with me. It definitely is, there is something wrong. That's what I think all the items, like we tested more than 4, landed on those. That's what they all share, right? That's why we ended up calling it concern. I will say it isn't sort of general self-blame because the results hold when we control for, and that's really consistent when we control for worry and general worry, right? Which would be it's not exactly self-criticism or self-blame, but so we do know that there's something specific that these people are concerned about their happiness, which is driving it. Because general worry doesn't explain those effects. But it could still be that it's sort of like blaming myself versus blaming the situation. And maybe if people blame their situation for where
Their lack of happiness, it's
Yeah.
not gonna make them happy either.
Maybe,
Angry and, victimized, but
Yeah.
it's different than that,
Yeah.
like, is it me or is it you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Do you have items that kind of have the flip of that concern piece? So like, can they appreciate being happy? Or I'm wondering if there's like a positive corollary to the negative injection, right? So is there?
I'm looking at the clock because I have these, I was trying to decide whether I should present this last sort of little set of studies, but it addresses your question and your last question, I think. So I'll just present, maybe I'll present just the results to address your questions.
Yeah, and we'll get to all have lunch afterwards,
So we get to
you might
discuss
want to
it.
ask audience question and address audience questions instead of us, because we'll get to
Okay,
get time.
sounds
with you.
good. Should I present those data? Or
Really,
should
yeah,
we
like
address
you said,
questions?
the results.
Okay.
We jumped, I think.
Okay.
Now that you
So-
teased us with it.
Okay. Like that, I want to live. So basically, this last set of studies that I wanted to show gets exactly at this question of like, what is the nature of the emotional nature of the judgment versus the emotional target, the emotional valence of the target emotion. And so this is work with Emily Wilroth, Gerald Young, and Maya Tamir. And so basically examining what I'm calling the complete space of reactions to emotions. So we're gonna look at positive and negative judgments separately from one another, about pleasant emotional states and unpleasant emotional states separately of one another. And the idea is that there's something unique to each of those quadrants of emotional judgments. So I'm gonna hop over all the methods slides, all of it. Just gonna remind us, we're gonna look at 4 unique types of judgments that people can make about their emotions. We have 4 different scales. And so basically, what we're finding or what we're hypothesizing, and that's exactly your question, is that sort of positive judgments of pleasant states should be uniquely beneficial. Negative judgments of unpleasant states should be uniquely harmful. And sort of the cross valence one quadrants were a little bit less sort of clear about. And so I'll just show you really briefly that across samples, there's a positive link for this positive pleasant combination, sort of a little bit more mixed for negative judgments of pleasant emotions, nothing for positive judgments of unpleasant emotions, and then negative relationships with psychological health for negative judgments of unpleasant emotions. And that's importantly, that's above and beyond, again, how people feel. So we're really isolating something in how people respond to and think about their emotions. So I'll just do takeaways really briefly and then get to questions from Zoom people. How people think about and react to their emotions deeply matters above and beyond emotional responses in general. There's 2 approaches to happiness. One is aspiring to happiness, and meaning that valuing happiness, even when it's extreme, is not necessarily detrimental to well-being. But this concern about and negative meta emotion and negative judgments tend to be bad. Lack of judgment, acceptance, and positive judgments, and that's exactly your questions, tend to be good. And I'll just close with a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh. People suffer because they're caught in their views. I would add views of emotion. As soon as we release those views, we're free and we don't suffer anymore. And this research seems to be consistent with that idea. And just thank my lab and you for attention and funding agencies. Thank you so much. At the end, wanted to make sure I get to take questions from.
Yeah, so you can put your videos back on and wave to Iris and she can see you clapping. And if you have a question, take yourself off mute. Looks like we have a question from Grace, one of our wonderful postdocs.
Hi, Grace.
Hi, I have a question. So I'm curious whether there are people who are high in aspiring to happiness might also be high in concern about happiness, because if they aspire to, they have higher aspiration, some of those people might also have a higher concern. Have you looked at whether they are positively correlated or not associated or negatively associated?
Yes, it's a great question. And in line with what we would expect. Oh, the chat.
Oh, just stop.
Oh, got it. Thank you. There are two correlated facets of valuing happiness. So there's sort of like an overall valuing happiness construct, exactly like what you're suspecting. And they're correlated about 0.3, 0.4 in some samples, even almost 0.5, those two facets. But there's still two distinct factors in the factor analysis. And so all the results that I showed today are when we control for the other element to sort of isolate out the pure concern and the pure aspiring element of those two. But they're definitely correlated in that people who value happiness highly in general are high on both of those. And so that's why we would, exactly like what you're suspecting, we would expect them to be positively correlated.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. That's really helpful and interesting. Thank you. Wonderful work.
Saw other questions earlier.
Hello,
Daniel?
can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So looking at like the concern / comparison step, and I'm glad you guys mentioned that study, the second set of studies that you guys mentioned, because that's kind of key to it. Basically, is reframing the key to kind of, I mean, you basically have to a subject that would want to aspire or basically is concerned about their happiness would not want to frame it in the sense of concern, because that has a negative kind of connotation and attitude that comes with it. Instead, do you think the study results would have been different if instead of concern, it would be framed as, for example, assessment, or like an assessment step to kind of frame it as an objective assessment of your goal, like of your achievement toward your set goals, as well as like I guess action to make like an action step to again reframe away from concern and you can only be concerned about this thing, you can only think about this thing and usually think about it negatively, versus assess, so objectively assess your goal attainment, and then set up actions that would bring you closer to that goal attainment where there are deficiencies, and all of this coming from the like, for example, in exercise writing this whole step out from the perspective of like a close friend, a concerned friend writing this assessment and next steps for your own goal attainment of happiness. Do you think the study would have been different if reframed in that way?
I don't know whether I think, so the one way to hear what you're saying is to think that it's sort of like, how do we treat this? Or how could we help people who are concerned be less concerned and avoid that sort of negative elaboration? And so one sense that we have is based on these data, we would recommend, like, very much so, and this is in line with, I think, what Alyssa, what you were suspecting, that sort of mindfulness plays a really important role here, in that I would think that one kind of treatment, if you will, of this tendency is to say, just do nothing extra. Don't imbue this gap, this comparison with a lot of meaning. Acknowledge it. Maybe that's what you mean by assessment. Acknowledge it, that's fine, but you don't have to, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, that there's something wrong with you, that you should be disappointed with your experiences. Keep going with the business of your life. So I think that would be one way, and maybe that's what you're saying, of dealing with that. But I'd be curious about, like, we haven't sort of thought about sort of ways to intervene yet. I'd be curious what others think about that. Yeah.
It's a great question. And we have a mindfulness expert here. We'll talk about that at lunch. So I think we should probably say goodbye to our Zoom audience, but it was wonderful to have you all. Iris can see some of your still faces.
Bye, everybody.
We'll
Nice
see you
to
in a month,
your
in June.
names and your still faces. Some of your not still faces. Bye. See you in real life, I hope.